people always talk about the unsustainable debt, and it's just kind of a given that that's a bad thing, and that our debt is bad. And we don't often articulate why or what the problem is, and how a problem could develop into a crisis. It's just kind of left unsaid. And so I thought we could begin there, just with what we are worried about, or what things could exacerbate what we're worried about. So when you did this project, what was the kind of the bottom line conclusions?
So, great question. And just to start with some basic framing, which is to say, if we were having this discussion 25 years ago, we would look at the Congressional Budget Office projections of the federal debt. And CBO thought in the late 90s that the federal debt would be a thing of the past. We'd fully pay off our debt within 10 years. And so, this was a problem which would be solved. We thought it would be solved 25 years ago. At the same time, as we thought that the debt was going to go to zero, we also thought that interest rates would rise fairly sharply. And it turns out we were wrong on both. So the debt skyrocketed, and interest rates, particularly after you're accounting for inflation, went close to zero. And so I think it's probably true that economists have not done a great job of understanding the relationship between interest rates and investment and the size of the federal debt. It is entirely clear that investors have been comfortable with a large and growing federal debt. What's less clear is whether or not they'll be comfortable moving forward. And just because something was true for 25 years doesn't mean it'll be true for the next 25 years. So the genesis for this paper was actually, I remember the conversation precisely, and I was giving a talk at Brown University. So I was sitting in a hotel room in Providence, and I was talking with Wendy on the phone about budget things. And I said, Wendy, clearly this is an unsustainable future. We can't just keep having our debt rise like this. And Wendy said, well, why not? And it was almost just like it's something you believe so strongly, but I didn't have a great justification. And I kind of stammered over my words and said, well, sometimes people will lose faith in the ability for the US government to repay interest. And she was like, why? We're the richest country on earth, and we can clearly keep paying our interest. It's just a matter of will. And so that was the genesis for the paper. And the fundamental question we asked was, when would the rising federal debt become a crisis? And we laid out 4 different possible scenarios. And the first was, in no particular order, if we're seeing really big shifts in demand or supply and the Federal Reserve can't mitigate it. So what would be a big shift in supply? And we can talk about this later, Bob, as you noted from the outset, but passing a reconciliation package that adds $7 trillion to the debt would be an example of maybe a sizable increase in the debt that markets just are uncomfortable handling. What would be a shift in demand? Well, a shift in demand could be if a foreign central bank engaged in a trade war with the United States decided it no longer wanted to invest in US treasuries, and it sold off $1 trillion or $2 trillion of US treasuries. So those are big shifts in supply and demand, and that could kick off a fiscal crisis. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2 would be if we had default risk introduced into treasuries. So right now, there's a lot of risk when you invest in treasuries. There's currency risk, there's inflation risk, but one type of risk which is not inherent in investing in treasuries is default risk. Every investor thinks it's virtually 100% chance that they'll get repaid on their principal and interest on those treasuries. And we may see the introduction of default risk into treasuries. That could happen if we hit the debt ceiling. That could happen if foreign investors are told that the US government will take a haircut on your interest payments. But there are lots of circumstances where you can imagine the rock solid 100% chance of getting paid on your treasury dissipates. The third scenario that we talked about would be if the Federal Reserve abandoned its inflation mandate. And so right now, I think, as your listeners probably know, the Federal Reserve has this dual mandate. It wants low unemployment and also stable and low prices. By that, they mean limited inflation. If you had a Fed, which was more political than we've seen in the past, and that Fed said, look, we're willing to accommodate big shifts in extra borrowing by buying up tons of US treasuries and thereby injecting a lot of extra money into the economy, investors might lose confidence as well. And that could lead to a fiscal crisis. And lastly, there could be a situation where the long-term fiscal outlook is just so awful, where investors lose confidence that they'll get paid on their interest on the treasuries. So those were the four circumstances that we thought the rising federal debt could lead to a fiscal crisis.